There is a category of crime so rare, so incomprehensible, that most people are convinced it only exists in fiction. The kind of thing you see in a Hollywood horror film. The kind of story you hear around a campfire and tell yourself, that couldn't actually happen. But it did happen. And what makes this story even more disturbing than the crime itself is what happened after. What you are about to hear is real. In 1981, a 32-year-old man sat across from a young woman in a park in one of the world's most sophisticated, most celebrated cities. They had met through university. She was brilliant. She was kind. She had her whole life ahead of her. He shot her, and then, over the course of the next several days, he consumed parts of her body. He was arrested. He was tried. He was found legally insane. And then, he was let go. Not placed in a facility permanently. Not monitored for life. Not exiled. Let go. He returned to his home country. He wrote a book about what he did. He became a minor celebrity. He gave interviews. He appeared in films. He described the experience in graphic detail, and people bought it. He is alive today. His victim is not. This is the story of Issei Sagawa, the cannibal killer who got away with it. June 13th, 1981. Paris, France. It was a Saturday afternoon when a man pushing a suitcase through the Bois de Boulogne, one of the city's most beloved public parks, dropped it. The suitcase split open, and what spilled out changed the lives of everyone who witnessed it. June 13th, 1981. Paris, France. The park had been full of people that day. Families, joggers, students lounging on the grass. It was the kind of perfect early summer afternoon that Paris is known for. Two cyclists were the first to realize something was wrong. The man with the suitcase, short, thin, unremarkable, had simply abandoned it near a pond and walked away in a hurry. When they investigated, what they found was not clothes, not valuables, not anything you would expect. Inside were the dismembered remains of a young woman. Within hours, French police had the Bois de Boulogne sealed. They were looking for the man the cyclists had described. Within days, his identity was confirmed through painstaking detective work, hotel records, and witness accounts. His name was Issei Sagawa. He was a Japanese national studying at the Sorbonne, one of the most prestigious universities in the world, on a full academic scholarship. And the young woman in that suitcase? Her name was Renée Hartevelt. She was 25 years old, a Dutch student, a fellow scholar, a woman described by everyone who knew her as warm, curious, full of life. Renée Hartevelt, 25 years old, Dutch student at the Sorbonne. She had been missing for 2 days before her remains were found. 2 days in which Issei Sagawa had remained in his apartment. 2 days in which he had done the unthinkable. When French police finally arrived at his door, what they found inside his small Paris apartment was the stuff of nightmares. And yet, despite all of it, this man would never spend a single day in prison. Not one. How? That is the question that has haunted legal scholars, crime investigators, and Renée Hartevelt's family for over 4 decades. That is the question we are going to answer today. To understand how a man commits an act this extreme and then walks free, you have to understand who he was long before the crime. Issei Sagawa was born on April 26, 1949, in Osaka, Japan. By most external accounts, he had an ordinary childhood. His father was a successful businessman. The family was not poor. They were not broken. There was no obvious trauma, no documented abuse, no catastrophic event that would mark a child's development in the way that criminologists so often find in violent offenders. And yet, from a very early age, Issei Sagawa was different. Age 6, first recorded violent fantasy. He was a sickly child. Premature at birth, small for his age throughout childhood, he grew up feeling physically inferior, especially in a culture where strength and discipline were prized. By his own later admission, and this is important because Sagawa was never shy about describing his interior world, he began having violent fantasies at a young age. Fantasies involving domination. involving consuming the strength of another person. He was 6 years old. Now, disturbing childhood thoughts alone do not make a killer. Psychologists are quick to note that dark thoughts are not the same as dark actions. Many people experience intrusive thoughts they never act upon. But Sagawa did not just have thoughts. He obsessed. He studied literature voraciously. He was, by academic standards, brilliant. He earned a degree in English literature from Wako University in Japan, then pursued a master's degree at the same institution. His academic performance was exceptional, but even through those years, his fixation deepened. He described it in later interviews he gave freely, casually, without apparent remorse, as a compulsion, an obsession with consuming the beauty and vitality of another person. He was particularly drawn to Western women. He described them as embodying a physical ideal he felt he could never personally achieve. In his mind, a mind that his own psychiatrist would later describe as deeply distorted, consuming them was a way of becoming them. His own psychiatrist described his psychology as uniquely distorted. In 1977, at the age of 28, Sagawa moved to Paris. He enrolled at the Institut de Langue et Civilisation Françaises and later gained admission to the Sorbonne's doctoral program in comparative literature. He was surrounded by brilliant minds. He was studying some of the world's greatest texts. He was, by every observable metric, a serious academic. And he was escalating. We know this because in 1979, 2 years before the murder, Sagawa attempted to assault a German woman in her apartment. He broke in while she slept and attempted to bite her. She woke up and screamed. He ran. He was arrested. And his father paid for him to be released. The charges were handled quietly. The incident was buried. 1979, Sagawa was arrested for attempted assault. Charges were dropped. 2 years later, Renée Hartevelt was dead. There is a moment in almost every true crime case where you look back and see the point where something could have been done differently, where a single decision made by a judge, a lawyer, a father, a social worker might have altered the course of events entirely. This was that moment, and it was ignored. Before we go further, if you're finding this story important, please consider subscribing. We cover real cases, real crimes, real failures of the justice system, and it's viewers like you who make that possible. Hit subscribe so you don't miss a single story. Backhand index pointing right subscribe. New videos every day. May 11th, 1981. That date matters, because on May 11th, 1981, Renée Hartevelt was alive. She had her plans, her thesis, her friendships, her future. Renée and Issei had known each other for some time through their university circles. She was fluent in several languages: Dutch, English, French, German, Japanese. Sagawa had approached her with an academic pretext. He wanted help practicing his German and translating poetry. She agreed. She was that kind of person. She agreed to help him. She was that kind of person. They had met socially before. There had been no visible warning signs from her perspective. He was awkward, perhaps, a little strange, but not threatening, not visibly threatening. She came to his apartment on the evening of May 11th, and she never left. What happened in that apartment has been described in detail by Sagawa himself, in his memoirs, in interviews, in a book he published after his release. For the purposes of this documentary, we will convey the factual sequence of events without reproduction of his graphic self-descriptions, because Renée Hartevelt was a human being, and she deserves to be treated as one, not as a chapter in her killer's autobiography. Here is what the forensic and investigative record confirms. Renée was shot from behind with a rifle while reading poetry aloud. She died within moments. She did not suffer a prolonged struggle. What followed, over the next 2 days, constituted acts of depravity that placed this case in a category shared by almost no other crime in modern legal history. Sagawa later photographed what he did. He kept records. He kept evidence, not out of carelessness, but because, in his mind, What he had done was something he had wanted to preserve, to remember. He kept records, not out of carelessness. He consumed portions of Renée Hartevelt's body. By June 13th, he could no longer store what remained in his small apartment. He packed the remains into 2 suitcases and attempted to dispose of them in the Bois de Boulogne. And that is where he dropped them. That is where the cyclists found them. That is where this story, which had already claimed one life, became something the world would be forced to reckon with for the next 40 years. French police moved quickly. A manhunt was underway within hours. But catching Sagawa was almost too easy. He had not hidden well. Hotel records, neighbor testimony, university records, all led investigators to his door within 72 hours of the discovery. When officers arrived at his apartment, he was there. He did not run. He did not fight. He opened the door. He opened the door. Inside, investigators found the photographs. They found the evidence of what had taken place. They found a man who seemed, to every officer present, almost entirely untroubled, not panicked, not remorseful, not disoriented, almost relieved, as if a weight had finally been lifted. He was arrested and taken into custody. And then began one of the most surreal legal proceedings in the history of modern criminal justice. French law in 1981 had clear provisions for crimes of this nature: murder, mutilation of a corpse, necrophagy, the consumption of human remains. These were not legal gray areas. These were serious charges carrying serious penalties. Sagawa was formally charged with murder. And here is where the story takes its first devastating turn. What happened next would define the term legal loophole. French prosecutors, understanding the nature of the case they were dealing with, ordered a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation of Sagawa before trial. 3 court-appointed psychiatrists examined him. Their conclusions were not ambiguous. Issei Sagawa, they determined, was legally insane at the time of the crime. Now, this is an important distinction that is critical to understanding everything that follows. Legally insane does not mean unaware of reality. It does not mean Sagawa did not know what he was doing. In fact, the psychiatric reports confirmed that he knew exactly what he was doing. But under French law at the time, legal insanity meant he could not be held criminally responsible for his actions. He could not be convicted. He could not be sentenced. He could only be committed to a psychiatric institution. French law, legal insanity equals no criminal conviction. Commitment to psychiatric care instead. He was committed to the Paul Giraud Psychiatric Hospital in Villejuif, just south of Paris. He remained there for 3 years. 3 years for murder, mutilation, and cannibalism. Meanwhile, his case attracted enormous attention. In Japan, the story was covered extensively by the press. And here is something that requires a moment of honest reflection. Rather than widespread horror, much of the coverage in Japan treated Sagawa with an extraordinary degree of fascination. Tabloids ran detailed accounts. Publishers reached out. His father, still wealthy, still influential, worked behind the scenes to manage his son's image. Japanese tabloids treated the story with fascination. By 1984, French authorities had reached a decision that would echo for decades. The charges against Sagawa were dropped, not because he was found innocent, not because new evidence emerged, but because the psychiatric determination of insanity meant the charges could not be prosecuted. Under French law, he had never technically been convicted of anything. And so, in the logical but morally grotesque way that legal systems sometimes function, he was transferable. His family petitioned for his return to Japan. French authorities, perhaps eager to end their own involvement in a case without a clean legal resolution, agreed. Issei Sagawa was deported to Japan in 1984. I want to pause here, because what you just heard is important, and it's the kind of story most channels won't dig into. If you want us to keep covering cases like this, cases where justice failed, your support on Sinister Secrets means everything. Link is in the description. When Sagawa arrived in Japan, French authorities transmitted his psychiatric records to the Japanese legal system. and Japanese psychiatric authorities reviewed those records, and they reached a conclusion that changed everything. The French psychiatric findings, they determined, were insufficient under Japanese legal standards. The documents were sealed, classified, inaccessible to the public, or to any Japanese court that might wish to pursue independent charges. Sagawa was admitted to Matsuzawa Hospital in Tokyo. He remained there for 15 months. And then, on August 12, 1986, citing a determination that he was sane and posed no further risk to the public, Japanese doctors released him. August 12, 1986. Released. Deemed no further risk to the public. He walked out of that hospital a free man. Renée Hartevelt had been dead for 5 years. Her family, her parents in the Netherlands, who had buried their daughter in pieces, received no compensation. No formal apology from any government. No justice. Just silence. If you're feeling a rage building in your chest right now, that's the correct response. Because what came next is perhaps the most disturbing chapter of all. In most criminal cases, even when a killer is found insane, even when a system fails, there is at least the cold comfort of invisibility. The killer goes away. The public moves on. The victim's family grieves in private. Issei Sagawa was denied that mercy, not by circumstance, but by choice. His choice. Within months of his release, Sagawa had a literary agent. He published a novel called In the Fog, a fictionalized account of the murder. It became a bestseller in Japan. His memoir became a bestseller. He gave interviews to newspapers, to magazines, to television programs. He appeared on talk shows, describing what he had done with the casual, almost academic detachment of a man discussing a particularly interesting film. He wrote restaurant reviews for a Japanese weekly magazine, reviews of food, which editors apparently found amusing or ironic or edgy enough to publish. He appeared in several films, not as a dramatized character, but as himself, a real person, a personality. Japanese culture, it must be said, has a complicated relationship with notoriety. The concept of infamy as celebrity is not unique to Japan. We see it in American true crime culture as well, in the way serial killers receive fan mail, in the way certain violent offenders become cultural touchstones. But what happened with Sagawa operated on a different level. He was not merely famous despite what he did. He was famous because of it. And publishers, television producers, and filmmakers facilitated that fame, actively, knowingly, and profitably. Meanwhile, Renée Hartevelt's family, particularly her father, Hans Hartevelt, spoke publicly and repeatedly about the injustice they had endured. Hans Hartevelt gave interviews in the Netherlands and internationally, describing the incomprehensible reality of watching his daughter's killer become a media figure. He described the French psychiatric system's handling of the case as a failure. He described the Japanese government's decision to seal the records and release Sagawa as a betrayal. He asked, in interview after interview, a question that had no satisfying answer. How can this be legal? Hans Hartevelt. How can this be legal? The answer is technical. It is procedural. It is the kind of answer that sounds rational in a law school textbook and sounds obscene when you say it to the parents of a murdered child. The answer is, because no single jurisdiction held complete legal authority and no jurisdiction was willing to take full responsibility, the case fell through the gaps. France could not convict him because their own psychiatrists had declared him legally insane. Japan could not prosecute him because the French charges had already been handled and double jeopardy principles complicated any fresh prosecution. And so no one did anything. A woman was murdered, mutilated, and consumed. And the legal system, in 2 countries, across 2 continents, produced exactly 0 convictions. 0. If this story makes you angry, if you think cases like this deserve more attention, please share this video, right now, with someone who needs to hear it. Sharing is the single most powerful thing you can do to help this channel reach more people, and it costs you nothing. Outbox share this video. It matters more than you know. Issei Sagawa lived as a free man for decades following his release. He was never placed under long-term mandatory supervision. He was never enrolled in a structured rehabilitation program. He was simply released and left to navigate the world on his own terms. For much of the late 1980s and 1990s, he was, by his own description, busy. Interviews, appearances, writing. He collaborated on a manga. He was the subject of a documentary. He became, in certain circles of Japanese underground culture, a figure of dark fascination. He became a figure of dark fascination. Forensic psychologists who reviewed his public statements in the years after his release noted something consistent and deeply troubling. There was no remorse. Not hidden remorse. Not suppressed remorse. No remorse. He described Renée Hartevelt in interviews with a kind of detached aesthetic appreciation, as if she were a painting he had once owned, rather than a human being whose life he had ended. He described the act itself in terms that his own interviewers sometimes seemed unprepared for. And yet he remained free. A slow, low swell. Sad rather than tense. Renée Hartevelt's family continued to speak out when they could. In interview, her relatives described the ongoing trauma of a grief that had no resolution, not just because she was gone, but because her killer had not been held accountable. Grief experts speak of something called ambiguous loss, the particular anguish experienced when closure is impossible. When there is no ending to point to and say, "This is over, justice was done, we can begin to heal." Renée's family never had that. Her family never had closure. In 2013, Sagawa suffered a stroke that left him significantly impaired physically. He was hospitalized, and his public presence diminished considerably. Reports emerged in subsequent years that he was living in poor health, dependent on care, largely removed from public life. In September 2022, multiple Japanese media outlets reported that Issei Sagawa had died, though some ambiguity existed in initial reporting. By the time of this production, his death had been confirmed by those close to him. He died of pneumonia at 73 years old. In his bed, peacefully, Renée Hartevelt died at 25, in an apartment in Paris, at the hands of a man she had trusted. Renée Hartevelt, 1956 to 1981. Every case like this one leaves behind a set of questions that the legal system cannot answer. Not because the answers don't exist, but because the system, as it is designed, is not built to ask them. The first question is obvious. Could this have been prevented? Yes. In 1979, Issei Sagawa broke into the apartment of a sleeping woman and attempted to bite her. He was arrested. His father's money made the problem disappear. If that arrest had been prosecuted, if he had been required to undergo genuine psychiatric evaluation and intervention at that moment, the trajectory of his life might have been different. More importantly, Renée Hartevelt's life might not have ended at 25. 1979, the arrest that could have changed everything. The second question is harder. Should legal insanity preclude all consequences? This is not a simple question, and it is not one with a single correct answer. The insanity defense exists for a reason. Mental illness is real. Diminished criminal responsibility is a legitimate concept in law. And the prospect of punishing someone who is genuinely unable to understand or control their actions raises serious moral and constitutional questions. But, and this is critical, the insanity defense was designed as an alternative to imprisonment, not as an alternative to all consequences. The implicit promise of the insanity defense is this: you will not go to prison, but you will receive treatment, supervision, and containment until you are genuinely safe. That promise was not honored here. Sagawa received treatment for a total of approximately 4.5 years between France and Japan for a crime that, by any reasonable measure, represented an extreme and enduring danger to others. 4.5 years. And then he was free. 4.5 years of psychiatric care. Then freedom. The third question, and perhaps the most uncomfortable, is this. What does it mean that the public was fascinated rather than horrified? This is not a question about Issei Sagawa. It is a question about us. The publishers who printed his memoir knew who he was. The television producers who booked him knew what he had done. The readers who bought his book, and there were many, knew the story, and they engaged anyway. There is something in human psychology, something studied by criminologists, anthropologists, and media scholars alike, that is drawn to the extreme edge of human experience. The darkest possible expression of what a person can do. True crime, as a genre, walks that line constantly. This channel walks that line. You are watching this channel, and that is not a judgment. That impulse to understand, to process, to confront the darkness rather than pretend it doesn't exist is fundamentally human. It may even be healthy, but it carries a responsibility. The responsibility of bearing witness. The responsibility to remember that behind every case, behind every statistic, behind every headline, there is a person. Renée Hartevelt was a person. She was not a plot point. She was not a cultural artifact. She was not the victim in someone else's story. She was a 25-year-old woman who loved languages, who helped a stranger with his poetry translation, who deserved to grow old. She deserved justice. She never got it. And that, more than the crime itself, as monstrous as it was, is the thing that should keep us up at night. There are cases in criminal justice history that become tests. Tests of the system's capacity for self-examination. Tests of whether the law can admit its own failures. The case of Issei Sagawa is one of those tests. And on every measurable level, prevention, prosecution, containment, accountability, the system failed. It failed Renée Hartevelt in 1979 when the warning signs were visible. It failed her in 1981 when the crime occurred. It failed her in 1984 when her killer was transferred rather than tried. It failed her in 1986 when he was released. It failed her every year after that when no government, French, Japanese, or Dutch, took meaningful action. Legal reform in extradition law, psychiatric commitment standards, and international criminal jurisdiction has advanced significantly since 1981. The specific gaps that allowed Sagawa's case to fall through the system have largely been closed, at least in theory. But theory and practice are different things. And the human cost of getting it wrong is not theoretical. It is Renée. It is her father's grief. It is the decades of silence. If you've stayed with us through this entire story, thank you. Not for watching, but for bearing witness. Because that is what true crime, at its best, asks of us. Not morbid curiosity, not entertainment. Witness. Remember Renée Hartevelt. Remember that justice is not automatic. And remember that the systems we build to protect people are only as strong as our willingness to hold them accountable when they fail. In memory of Renée Hartevelt, 1956 to 1981. If this story moved you,